Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, Rhode Island. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1974, Robert and Margaret Whitmore made a decision that would forever alter the course of their lives. The couple, both in their early 30s, purchased a colonial-era house in the remote woodlands of Exeter, Rhode Island, approximately 12 miles southwest of Providence. The property, known locally as the Aldrich House, had stood empty for nearly 3 years following the sudden departure of its previous occupants. The Whitmores were drawn to the property not by its reputation, but by its price. At $32,000, the two-story colonial was listed well below market value for similar properties in the region. Robert, a mechanical engineer working for a Providence manufacturing company, saw the purchase as a sound financial investment. Margaret, a former librarian who had recently left her position to focus on her photography, viewed the isolated setting as ideal for her artistic pursuits. What the couple did not know during those initial autumn days was that the Aldrich House carried with it a documented history that local real estate agents had been reluctant to discuss. County records from the 1950s and early 1960s contained scattered reports filed by previous residents, descriptions of unusual sounds, unexplained temperature fluctuations, and what multiple tenants described as an overwhelming sense of being observed. The house itself dated to 1847, constructed by Samuel Aldrich, a prosperous merchant who had made his fortune in the textile trade. Aldrich family records, maintained in the Rhode Island Historical Society archives, indicate that the family occupied the residence for nearly 70 years before the last direct descendant, Eleanor Aldrich, transferred ownership to the state in 1923. Following this transfer, the property changed hands 14 times over the subsequent 50 years, with most occupants remaining for less than 2 years. Local newspaper archives from the Exeter Tribune, dating to 1961, contain brief mentions of the property in connection with several incidents that prompted police visits. These reports, while sparse in detail, reference complaints of trespassing, unusual disturbances during overnight hours, and what one former resident described to officers as sounds suggesting the presence of additional occupants when the house was supposedly empty. The architectural details of the Aldrich House reflected the construction methods of the mid-19th century. The structure featured thick fieldstone foundations, hand-hewn timber framing, and a complex system of interconnected cellars that had originally served various storage and preservation functions. The main house rose 2 full stories above ground level, with an additional partial third floor tucked beneath the steep-pitched roof. Multiple chimneys served fireplaces in nearly every room, creating an intricate network of flues and passages within the walls. The property encompassed nearly 8 acres of heavily wooded land, bordered on 3 sides by State Forest Preserve and on the 4th by an abandoned logging road that had not seen regular maintenance since the 1930s. The nearest neighbor resided approximately 1 mile to the northeast, separated by dense stands of oak, maple, and pine that effectively isolated the Aldrich House from casual observation or oversight. Robert Whitmore's first encounter with these unexplained phenomena occurred during their 3rd week of residence. According to his own written account, discovered years later among his personal papers, he was awakened at approximately 2:30 a.m. by what he described as the sound of footsteps in the upstairs hallway. The account, dated October 22, 1974, notes that he investigated the source of the sound, but found no evidence of an intruder. Margaret, according to the same document, claimed to have heard nothing. This initial incident established a pattern that would continue throughout the Whitmores' residence at the property. Robert's detailed records, maintained in a composition notebook that he kept in his bedside drawer, document 37 separate incidents between October 22nd and December 15th, 1974. These incidents range from unexplained sounds to the discovery of objects in locations where neither resident recalled placing them. The couple's daily routine during those early weeks followed a predictable pattern. Robert would depart for Providence each morning at 7 a.m., returning typically around 6 p.m. Margaret spent her days cataloging and organizing their belongings, setting up her darkroom in the basement, and exploring the surrounding wooded areas with her camera. Her photographic work from this period, later donated to the Rhode Island State Archives, captures the isolation of the property with an almost clinical precision. Margaret's approach to documenting their new environment revealed her training as a librarian in its systematic thoroughness. She maintained detailed inventories of their possessions, noting the specific placement of furniture, household items, and personal belongings. This meticulous record-keeping would later prove crucial in identifying the subtle evidence of unauthorized presence within their home. By November of 1974, both Robert and Margaret had begun documenting what they initially attributed to the house settling or the effects of the changing season. Margaret's journal entries, written in her precise librarian script, describe a growing awareness of sounds that seemed to originate from within the walls themselves. Her entry, dated November 8th, notes that these sounds followed no discernible pattern but occurred most frequently during the hours between sunset and sunrise. The quality of these sounds defied easy categorization. Margaret's descriptions range from what she termed whisper quiet footsteps to occasional creaking that seemed to move through the house in a deliberate progression. Most unsettling were the sounds she described as resembling normal household activities conducted at volumes just below the threshold of clear identification. Robert's engineering background led him to conduct systematic investigations of the house's structural elements in an attempt to identify rational explanations for the phenomena they were experiencing. His measurements of temperature, humidity, and air circulation patterns revealed several anomalies that suggested the building's environmental systems were not functioning according to their original specifications. Temperature readings taken throughout the house revealed variations of up to 15 degrees between rooms on the same floor with no apparent correlation to heating sources, sun exposure, or external weather conditions. Additionally, certain areas of the house exhibited air circulation patterns that seemed inconsistent with the visible ductwork and ventilation systems. The first significant incident that prompted the couple to seek outside consultation occurred on November 15, 1974. Margaret's journal entry for that date describes awakening to find the basement door, which she was certain had been secured before retiring, standing open. Her investigation revealed that several items in her darkroom had been moved, though nothing appeared to be missing. Robert's response, according to the same entry, was to install additional locks on both the basement door and the exterior entrances to the property. Margaret's darkroom occupied a section of the basement that had been partially finished by previous residents. The space contained developing equipment, chemical storage, and a collection of her photographic work spanning several years. Her discovery that items in this space had been disturbed was particularly unsettling because the darkroom required complete darkness for proper function, meaning that whoever had entered the space had either worked in total darkness or possessed detailed knowledge of the room's layout. The specific nature of the disturbance suggested deliberate examination rather than random searching. Photographic prints had been removed from their storage boxes and arranged on the work surface, apparently for viewing. Several contact sheets had been separated from their negatives and placed in positions suggesting they had been studied under the room's red safety lighting. During this same period, Margaret had begun corresponding with Dr. Harold Vance, a professor of psychology at Brown University, who had published several papers on environmental factors affecting human perception and behavior. Dr. Vance's initial response to Margaret's inquiry, dated November 20, 1974, suggested that older homes often created acoustic phenomena that could be misinterpreted by residents unfamiliar with the building's characteristics. Dr. Vance's academic background included extensive research into what he termed environmental psychology, the study of how physical surroundings influenced human behavior, perception, and mental state. His published work had examined cases where individuals living in particular types of buildings or geographical locations had reported experiences that challenged conventional explanations. However, Dr. Vance's interest in the Whitmore case increased significantly when Margaret mentioned the property's history of brief tenancies. His subsequent letter, dated December 2, 1974, requested permission to visit the house and conduct what he described as environmental measurements. Margaret's journal indicates that both she and Robert agreed to this request, viewing Dr. Vance's scientific approach as a means of resolving their growing unease. Dr. Vance's first visit to the Aldrich house took place on December 7, 1974. His field notes from that date, later archived with his papers at Brown University, describe a property that exhibited several unusual characteristics beyond those already identified by the Whitmores. His measurements confirmed the temperature and air circulation anomalies that Robert had documented, but also revealed additional environmental irregularities. Sound transmission tests conducted throughout the house revealed acoustic properties that seemed inconsistent with the building's construction. Certain walls transmitted sound more effectively than others, with no apparent correlation to their construction materials or thickness. Additionally, some areas of the house produced distinct echoing effects that suggested the presence of void spaces or cavities not accounted for in the building's apparent structural layout. More significantly, Dr. Vance's notes reference his discovery of what appeared to be a sealed chamber behind a false wall in the basement. This space, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, contained what he described as makeshift furnishings and several personal items that appeared to date from the 1950s. Among these items were clothing, food containers, and a notebook containing entries in an unidentified handwriting. The discovery of this concealed space required careful examination to determine the method of access. Dr. Vance's investigation revealed that the false wall had been constructed to match the appearance of the surrounding basement walls, while concealing a doorway that could be opened from within the hidden chamber. The construction showed evidence of considerable skill and planning, suggesting it had been created by someone with expertise in carpentry and building modification. The chamber itself had been equipped with basic amenities, including ventilation that connected to the house's main air circulation system, electrical connections tapped from the building's wiring, and a small heating element that drew warmth from the main furnace without affecting the temperature readings in the occupied portions of the house. These modifications would have allowed a person to live in the space with reasonable comfort while remaining completely undetected by the house's official residents. The notebook, later analyzed by handwriting experts at the Rhode Island State Police Laboratory, contained entries spanning several months in 1958. The writing, determined to belong to someone other than any documented resident of the property during that period, described a daily routine of remaining hidden within the concealed chamber during daylight hours and moving freely through the house during the night. These entries provided disturbing insights into the mindset and activities of the chamber's occupant. The writing revealed detailed knowledge of the habits, schedules, and personal characteristics of the house's official residents during 1958. The author had documented their meal times, sleep patterns, social visitors, and even private conversations conducted within various rooms of the house. The entries suggested that the author had been living secretly within the house while the official residents remained unaware of this presence. More unsettling were descriptions of activities that indicated the hidden occupant had been regularly moving through the house during the residents' absence, examining their possessions, reading their mail, and documenting their personal lives with clinical precision. Further investigation by Dr. Vance revealed that the concealed chamber had been accessed through a passage connecting to the house's original root cellar. This passage, obscured by decades of accumulated debris and what appeared to be deliberate concealment, would have allowed an occupant to enter and exit the property without using the main entrances. The passage extended approximately 30 feet from the concealed chamber to an exit point beneath an overgrown section of the building's foundation. This exit had been carefully camouflaged to appear as natural deterioration of the stonework while providing a means of access that would be virtually invisible to casual observation. County records from 1958 show that during the time period referenced in the notebook entries, the house was officially occupied by the Patterson family, who departed suddenly in October of that year after residing in the property for only 4 months. Police reports from that period, located in the archives of the Exeter Police Department, document that the Pattersons had contacted authorities regarding concerns about repeated instances of missing food items and household objects. The Patterson family's complaints, filed in September of 1958, described a pattern of small-scale theft that seemed to target consumable items rather than objects of monetary value. Food items disappeared from their pantry and refrigerator, personal hygiene products vanished from bathrooms, and clothing items were occasionally found in locations where family members had not placed them. Local police investigation of these complaints had failed to identify any evidence of forced entry or to develop any leads regarding the identity of the person responsible for these incidents. The case was classified as petty theft and remained open when the Patterson family abandoned the property in October 1958. Dr. Vance's documentation of these findings prompted him to expand his investigation beyond the Whitmore case. His research into the property's history, conducted throughout the winter of 1974-75, revealed a pattern of discoveries that previous residents had made but had not reported to authorities. Former residents contacted by Dr. Vance described finding personal items that did not belong to them, evidence of food consumption that they could not account for, and the persistent sense that the house was occupied by someone other than themselves. Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, who had rented the property with her husband during 1959 and 1960, provided Dr. Vance with a detailed account of their experiences that closely paralleled those reported by later residents. Mrs. Crawford described finding evidence that someone had been using their kitchen during their absence, including cooking utensils that had been washed and replaced, but showed signs of recent use. The Crawfords had also discovered that items from their personal wardrobe had been worn and returned to their closets. Mrs. Crawford's description of finding her clothing items arranged differently than she had left them, combined with subtle evidence of wear, suggested that someone had been regularly accessing their personal belongings. The most disturbing revelation emerged from Dr. Vance's interview with Mrs. Dorothy Chen, who had rented the property during the summer of 1962. Mrs. Chen's account, recorded in Dr. Vance's notes dated January 15, 1975, described her discovery of a collection of photographs hidden within the walls of the upstairs bedroom. These photographs, which Mrs. Chen had destroyed before leaving the property, reportedly showed previous residents of the house engaged in their daily activities, taken from angles that suggested the photographer had been concealed within the building itself. The images included scenes of families eating meals, watching television, and conducting private conversations, all captured without the subject's knowledge or awareness. Mrs. Chen's description of the photographs indicated they had been taken over an extended period, possibly spanning several years and multiple tenancies. The images were organized in a manner suggesting systematic surveillance and documentation of the private lives of the house's various residents. Dr. Vance's investigation also uncovered references to the house and medical records from Rhode Island State Hospital, located approximately 20 miles from the property. These records, dating from 1957 to 1963, document the treatment of several individuals who had been found wandering in the wooded area surrounding the Aldrich house. These individuals, described in the medical notes as suffering from severe disorientation and an inability to account for extended periods of time, had been discovered by local hunters or hikers and brought to the hospital for evaluation. The medical records describe patients who exhibited signs of prolonged exposure to outdoor conditions, despite claiming to have no memory of leaving their homes. Several of these individuals provided descriptions of being cared for by an unknown person during their missing time, someone who had provided them with food and shelter while keeping them hidden from search parties organized by their families. The patients' accounts, while fragmented and confused, suggested they had been held in underground or concealed spaces and had been fed and cared for by someone who had not revealed their identity. Dr. Vance's analysis of these medical records revealed a geographic pattern centered on the area surrounding the Aldrich house. All of the individuals had been discovered within a 5-mile radius of the property, and the timing of their disappearances correlated with periods when the house was either vacant or occupied by tenants who had reported unusual disturbances. The medical evaluations of these individuals had failed to identify any common factors that might explain their shared experience of disorientation and memory loss. Physical examinations revealed no evidence of injury or substance exposure that could account for their condition. The cases were generally attributed to exposure-related confusion, and the individuals were released after brief observation periods. Dr. Vance's efforts to trace the identity of the person responsible for these activities led him to examine state records of individuals who had been reported missing in the Rhode Island area during the 1950s and early 1960s. His findings, documented in a report submitted to the Rhode Island State Police in February of 1975, identified 7 cases of missing persons whose disappearances coincided geographically and temporally with the strange occurrences at the Aldrich house. Among these cases was that of Thomas Brennan, a former patient at Rhode Island State Hospital who had disappeared from the facility in March of 1957. Brennan, who had been receiving treatment for what hospital records described as acute social withdrawal and paranoid ideation, had vanished from the hospital grounds during an outdoor work assignment. Despite extensive searching, no trace of Brennan had been discovered, and the case had been closed as an unexplained disappearance. Hospital records provided detailed information about Brennan's background and psychological profile. Born in 1921, Brennan had served in the Pacific Theater during World War II and had been hospitalized following his return from military service in 1946. His medical records described symptoms consistent with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the terminology and treatment approaches of the 1940s and 1950s were significantly different from contemporary understanding. Brennan's hospitalization had been precipitated by his increasing inability to function in normal social environments. Family members had reported that he had become progressively withdrawn and suspicious, avoiding contact with neighbors and spending most of his time in the basement of the family home, where he had constructed an elaborate system of hiding places and surveillance positions. Prior to his hospitalization, Brennan had worked as a carpenter and had developed considerable expertise in building modification and concealment construction. His military service had included training in reconnaissance and camouflage techniques that had been applied to his civilian carpentry work. Hospital staff noted his ability to construct hiding spaces and concealed compartments that were virtually undetectable even to thorough searches. Dr. Vance's analysis of the timeline suggested that Brennan's disappearance had coincided with the first documented reports of unusual phenomena at the Aldrich house. Hospital records indicated that Brennan possessed skills in carpentry and construction, knowledge that would have enabled him to create the concealed chamber and modify the property's basement to accommodate long-term habitation. The handwriting analysis of the notebook entries found in the concealed chamber provided additional support for Dr. Vance's theory. Comparison with Brennan's hospital records revealed significant similarities in letter formation and writing style, though the analysis could not provide a definitive identification due to the deteriorated condition of the notebook pages. Additional evidence supporting the Brennan theory emerged from Dr. Vance's examination of the construction techniques used in creating the concealed chamber and associated passages. The workmanship exhibited characteristics consistent with professional carpentry skills, and several specific techniques matched methods that hospital records indicated Brennan had learned during his military service and civilian work experience. By March of 1975, Dr. Vance had developed a working theory that Thomas Brennan had been living clandestinely within the Aldrich house for nearly 17 years, sustaining himself through a combination of foraging, theft from temporary residents, and what appeared to be a complex system of psychological manipulation designed to drive away occupants who might discover his presence. This theory explained not only the phenomena experienced by the Whitmores and previous residents, but also the broader pattern of unusual incidents documented in the surrounding area. Dr. Vance's analysis suggested that Brennan had developed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that allowed him to manipulate environmental factors in ways that would create fear and unease without revealing his actual presence. The psychological profile that emerged from Dr. Vance's research described an individual whose military training and mental condition had combined to create someone uniquely equipped for long-term survival in concealment. Brennan's paranoid ideation, rather than being simply dysfunctional, had apparently provided him with heightened awareness of potential threats and exceptional motivation for remaining undetected. Dr. Vance's theory explained the pattern of brief tenancies that had characterized the property's history. Brennan, according to this analysis, had deliberately created an environment of fear and unease that consistently resulted in residents abandoning the property before they could conduct thorough investigations that might reveal his hiding place. The evidence suggesting Brennan's long-term residence included modifications to the heating system that would have allowed him to draw warmth from the main furnace without affecting the temperature readings in the occupied portions of the house. Additionally, Dr. Vance discovered that the property's electrical system had been modified to include several circuits that were not connected to the main power meter, effectively providing Brennan with electricity that would not be reflected in the utility bills paid by the official residents. Water access had been achieved through a connection to the house's main plumbing system that had been concealed within the basement walls. This connection provided access to both hot and cold water while remaining undetectable to casual inspection of the property's plumbing. Most disturbing was Dr. Vance's discovery that Brennan appeared to have been systematically documenting the lives of the families and individuals who had rented the property. The concealed chamber contained an extensive collection of personal items that had been taken from previous residents, arranged in a manner that suggested careful study and cataloging. These items included clothing, personal letters, photographs, and household objects, all labeled with dates and what appeared to be detailed notes about the habits and routines of their original owners. The collection represented nearly 2 decades of systematic observation and documentation, creating what Dr. Vance described as an archive of human behavior compiled by someone operating completely outside normal social structures. The organization of this collection revealed a mind that approached human observation with scientific precision. Items were categorized by type, date of acquisition, and the identity of their original owners. Notes accompanying each item described when and how it had been obtained, along with observations about its significance to the resident from whom it had been taken. Personal letters had been carefully preserved and annotated with notes about family relationships, financial concerns, and emotional states revealed in the correspondence. Photographs had been arranged chronologically to create timelines of family events, children's development, and relationship changes. Even mundane items like grocery lists and appointment calendars had been preserved and analyzed for patterns in residents' daily routines. The implications of Dr. Vance's findings extended beyond the immediate mystery of the Aldrich house. His documentation suggested that Brennan had developed an elaborate system of psychological manipulation that allowed him to maintain control over the property while remaining undetected. This system included the strategic creation of sounds and disturbances designed to create fear, the relocation of personal items to create confusion, and what Dr. Vance described as a pattern of subtle environmental modifications that would gradually erode the mental stability of the official residents. Analysis of the timing and nature of the disturbances reported by various residents revealed what Dr. Vance characterized as a deliberate campaign of psychological pressure. Incidents were timed to occur when residents were most vulnerable, typically during nighttime hours when normal sensory cues were diminished. The nature of the disturbances was calculated to create unease without providing clear evidence of an external cause. The strategic placement of moved objects and the selection of items to be relocated suggested deep understanding of human psychological responses to environmental anomalies. Items were moved in ways that would be noticed but could potentially be attributed to forgetfulness or oversight. The cumulative effect of these incidents was to create persistent doubt about one's own perceptions and mental state. Robert and Margaret Whitmore's response to Dr. Vance's findings was initially one of relief that a rational explanation had been discovered for their experiences. However, this relief quickly transformed into a deeper form of unease as they began to comprehend the full implications of having unknowingly shared their home with someone who had been observing and documenting their most private moments. Margaret's journal entries from late March 1975 describe a growing paranoia that extended beyond the immediate threat posed by Brennan's presence. The knowledge that their daily routines had been monitored and recorded created what she described as a fundamental violation of their sense of safety and privacy. The realization that someone had been watching them sleep, eat, and conduct their private conversations created a form of psychological trauma that persisted even after the logical explanation had been provided. Robert's response, according to the same entries, was to begin sleeping with a loaded firearm and to conduct nightly searches of the property that became increasingly obsessive in their thoroughness. His engineering background led him to devise elaborate security measures designed to detect any attempt to enter their living spaces. But these measures served mainly to reinforce his awareness of their vulnerability. The couple's relationship began to show strain under the pressure of their altered understanding of their home environment. Margaret's journal entries describe increasing tension between them as they struggled to adapt to the knowledge that their privacy had been systematically violated over an extended period. Sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, and persistent anxiety became ongoing problems for both residents. The situation reached a critical point on April 3, 1975, when Robert discovered fresh evidence of Brennan's presence within the concealed chamber. Among the items found were photographs of Margaret engaged in her photography work in the surrounding woods, images that had been taken within the previous week from concealed positions that indicated Brennan had been tracking her movements even in areas well away from the house itself. These photographs revealed that Brennan's surveillance activities extended far beyond the immediate confines of the house. The images showed Margaret at various locations throughout the 8-acre property, captured from angles that suggested the photographer had been positioned in carefully prepared hiding spots that provided clear views while remaining concealed from the subject. The quality and composition of the photographs indicated considerable expertise in surveillance photography. The images were sharp and well composed, suggesting the use of professional-grade equipment and advanced knowledge of photographic technique. The fact that Margaret had been completely unaware of being photographed, despite her own training as a photographer, underscored the sophistication of Brennan's concealment methods. Analysis of the photograph locations allowed Dr. Vance and police investigators to identify several additional hiding places that Brennan had constructed throughout the wooded areas surrounding the house. These positions had been chosen to provide comprehensive observation coverage of the property while remaining invisible to normal use of the grounds. Dr. Vance's consultation with law enforcement resulted in the organization of a coordinated search of the property and surrounding wooded areas on April 8, 1975. This search, conducted by officers from the Rhode Island State Police and representatives from the Exeter Police Department, revealed additional hiding places that Brennan had constructed throughout the woods surrounding the property. These hiding places, described in the police reports as elaborate camouflaged shelters, contained supplies and equipment that suggested Brennan had been preparing for the possibility of discovery. The shelters included cached food, clothing, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment that would have allowed him to monitor the house from remote positions. The construction of these shelters demonstrated the same level of craftsmanship and attention to concealment that had characterized the modifications to the house itself. Each shelter had been built to blend seamlessly with its natural surroundings while providing weather protection and storage space for extended occupation. The locations had been chosen to provide strategic advantages for observation and escape routes while remaining invisible to casual discovery. The search teams discovered a network of concealed paths connecting the various shelters and observation positions. These paths had been created by careful removal of undergrowth and strategic placement of natural materials to create routes that could be traveled quickly and quietly without leaving obvious evidence of passage. However, the extensive search failed to locate Brennan himself. The evidence suggested that he had abandoned the property shortly before the police investigation, taking with him only essential personal items and leaving behind the extensive collection of materials he had gathered over nearly 2 decades of secret residence. The timing of Brennan's departure suggested that he had been aware of the increased attention his activities were receiving. Dr. Vance theorized that Brennan's heightened paranoia and surveillance skills had allowed him to detect the investigation before it had progressed to the point of direct threat to his concealment. Physical evidence at several of the shelter sites indicated recent occupation, suggesting that Brennan had abandoned his positions only days or perhaps hours before the search was conducted. Personal items and food supplies showed signs of hasty removal, and several pieces of surveillance equipment had been left behind in what appeared to be rapid evacuation. The police investigation's failure to locate Brennan created a new source of anxiety for the Whitmores. The knowledge that he remained at large, combined with evidence suggesting he had been monitoring their activities even outside the immediate property, led to their decision to abandon the Aldrich house permanently. Margaret's final journal entry regarding their residence at the property, dated April 15, 1975, describes their departure as both a physical and psychological necessity. The entry notes that despite the logical explanation for the phenomena they had experienced, the house had become psychologically uninhabitable for them. The couple's departure marked the end of their direct involvement in the case, but their documentation and cooperation with Dr. Vance's investigation had provided crucial evidence for understanding the full scope of Brennan's activities. Their meticulous record-keeping had allowed investigators to reconstruct nearly 2 decades of clandestine occupation and surveillance. Following the Whitmores' departure, the Aldrich house was again placed on the market, though this time with full disclosure of the circumstances that had led to the most recent tenancy's termination. The property remained unsold for nearly 2 years before being purchased by the state of Rhode Island in 1977 for use as a research facility studying environmental factors in historic buildings. The state's acquisition of the property was partly motivated by Dr. Vance's recommendation that the site be preserved for continued research into the psychological and environmental factors that had made Brennan's long-term concealment possible. The unique circumstances of the case provided opportunities for studying human adaptation to extreme isolation and the psychological mechanisms involved in long-term surveillance and manipulation. Dr. Vance's investigation of the Aldrich house case continued beyond the immediate resolution of the Whitmore situation. His subsequent research, conducted between 1975 and 1978, focused on the psychological mechanisms that had allowed Brennan to maintain his secret residence for such an extended period. This research involved detailed analysis of the environmental modifications Brennan had made to the property, psychological profiling based on the evidence of his activities, and broader study of similar cases documented in psychiatric and criminal justice literature. Dr. Vance's work contributed to improved understanding of how individuals with certain psychological profiles might adapt to extreme social isolation while maintaining complex survival strategies. Dr. Vance's analysis, published in a limited circulation academic journal in 1979, identified several factors that had contributed to Brennan's success in remaining undetected. The remote location of the property provided natural concealment, while the building's age and architectural complexity offered numerous opportunities for hidden spaces and concealed access points. More significantly, Dr. Vance identified psychological factors that had made the property's tenants particularly susceptible to Brennan's manipulation. The isolation of the location created a sense of vulnerability that was easily exploited through subtle environmental modifications. Additionally, the tendency of residents to rationalize unusual occurrences rather than investigate them thoroughly had provided Brennan with a consistent margin of safety. The case also revealed what Dr. Vance described as a form of adaptive behavior that allowed Brennan to survive independently while maintaining his secret residence. This behavior included sophisticated knowledge of human psychological responses, highly developed skills in concealment and stealth, and an apparent ability to subsist on minimal resources while avoiding detection by both residents and authorities. Thomas Brennan was never located, despite continued efforts by law enforcement agencies throughout Rhode Island and neighboring states. The investigation was officially suspended in 1978, though the case remained open in the files of the Rhode Island State Police. The search for Brennan had extended across multiple states, involving coordination between Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts law enforcement agencies. The investigation had included examination of abandoned buildings, remote woodland areas, and other locations that might provide opportunities for concealed long-term residence. Several potential sightings were investigated during the years following Brennan's disappearance from the Aldrich house, but none resulted in confirmed contact or apprehension. The sightings generally described an individual matching Brennan's physical description, who had been observed in remote areas or abandoned buildings, typically by hikers, hunters, or other outdoor recreationists. The final documented sighting, potentially related to Brennan, occurred in October of 1976, when hikers in the Patchogue State Forest area of Connecticut reported encountering a man matching his description. The individual, described as approximately 60 years of age, with extensive knowledge of woodland survival techniques, had provided assistance to the hikers who had become lost during an overnight camping trip. According to the hiker's account, filed with Connecticut State Police, the man had led them to safety without revealing his identity or explaining his presence in the remote forest area. When the hikers offered to provide him with transportation to the nearest town, he declined and disappeared back into the woods. The man's behavior and apparent expertise in wilderness survival were consistent with Brennan's known skills and psychological profile. However, the encounter had been too brief to allow for positive identification, and subsequent searches of the area failed to locate any evidence of long-term habitation or concealment. Dr. Vance's final report on the Aldrich House case, completed in 1979, concluded that the incident represented a unique intersection of mental illness, environmental opportunity, and social isolation that had created conditions allowing for an unprecedented form of human parasitism. The report noted that Brennan's ability to maintain his secret residence demonstrated a level of planning and execution that suggested his mental condition, while clearly abnormal, had not prevented him from developing highly sophisticated survival and concealment strategies. The case challenged conventional understanding of how mental illness might manifest in extreme social isolation. Dr. Vance's analysis suggested that Brennan's paranoid ideation, rather than being purely dysfunctional, had provided him with enhanced survival capabilities in his chosen environment. His hypervigilance, suspicion of others, and elaborate concealment strategies had proven highly adaptive for maintaining undetected residence within occupied buildings. The case also demonstrated how military training, carpentry skills, and psychological dysfunction could combine to create an individual capable of sustained survival outside normal social structures. Brennan's technical abilities had been crucial in creating the physical infrastructure necessary for his concealment, while his psychological condition had provided the motivation and planning capability for long-term implementation of his survival strategy. Dr. Vance's recommendations, based on his investigation of the case, included suggestions for improved monitoring of individuals released from institutional care and enhanced communication between law enforcement agencies regarding missing persons cases that might involve similar circumstances. The recommendations emphasized the need for better tracking systems for individuals with specific psychological profiles and technical skills that might enable them to live undetected in concealed locations. The case had revealed gaps in institutional oversight and interagency communication that had allowed Brennan's disappearance to go unnoticed for nearly 2 decades. The Aldrich House itself underwent significant modifications during its period of state ownership. The concealed chamber and associated passages were sealed, and the building's interior was extensively renovated to eliminate the architectural features that had made Brennan's long-term concealment possible. The renovation process involved detailed documentation of all the modifications Brennan had made to the building systems. This documentation provided valuable insights into the technical expertise required for such extensive concealment and served as a guide for identifying similar modifications in other buildings where unauthorized occupancy might be suspected. In 1983, the property was again sold to private owners, a family from Boston who purchased it with full knowledge of its history. According to county records, this family resided in the house without incident for nearly 15 years, before selling it to develop the land for a residential subdivision. The successful occupation of the property by the Boston family was attributed partly to the modifications made during the state ownership period and partly to the family's awareness of the building's history. Their knowledge of the previous incidents allowed them to implement security measures and monitoring procedures that would have made unauthorized occupancy extremely difficult. The house was demolished in 1998, and the site is now occupied by a cluster of modern homes whose residents, according to local sources, remain largely unaware of the property's unusual history. The development process included extensive excavation that revealed several additional concealed spaces and tunnels that had not been discovered during earlier investigations. Margaret Whitmore continued her photography work following their experience at the Aldrich House, though her focus shifted from landscape photography to documentary work, focusing on abandoned buildings and forgotten places. Her portfolio from this later period archived at the Rhode Island Historical Society, include several series examining the relationship between architectural spaces and human psychology. Margaret's work during the late 1970s and early 1980s documented abandoned institutional buildings, empty houses with histories of unusual incidents, and other locations where the interaction between human behavior and environmental factors had created unique circumstances. Her photography was informed by her experience at the Aldrich house and contributed to broader understanding of how physical spaces could influence human psychology and behavior. Robert Whitmore returned to his engineering career, but developed a secondary interest in home security systems and architectural design. His subsequent professional work included consultation on residential security issues and the development of building standards intended to minimize opportunities for unauthorized access and concealment. Robert's expertise in identifying and preventing unauthorized access became sought after by both private clients and institutional facilities. His understanding of the technical methods used by individuals seeking to remain concealed within buildings contributed to improved security protocols and detection systems. Dr. Vance's research inspired additional academic interest in what came to be known as environmental manipulation cases. His work influenced subsequent studies of institutional treatment failures and the long-term social adaptation of individuals with severe psychological disorders. The academic literature that developed around the Aldrich House case contributed to improved understanding of how mental illness might manifest in extreme circumstances, and how individuals with certain psychological profiles might adapt to life outside conventional social structures. This understanding influenced both clinical treatment approaches and law enforcement training programs. The case files related to Thomas Brennan's disappearance and the Aldrich House investigation were transferred to the Rhode Island State Archives in 1985, where they remain accessible to researchers studying forensic psychology and unsolved missing persons cases. Access to these files has been restricted to qualified researchers, but the documentation has contributed to numerous academic studies and training programs for law enforcement and mental health professionals. The case continues to serve as an example of how environmental factors, psychological dysfunction, and technical expertise can combine in unexpected ways. Several academic papers published in the years following Dr. Vance's initial research have cited the Aldrich House case as an example of the complex interactions between mental illness, social isolation, and criminal behavior. These studies have contributed to improved understanding of how individuals with certain psychological profiles might exploit environmental opportunities for survival and concealment. Contemporary research has also examined the case for insights into surveillance psychology and the motivations behind long-term observation and documentation of unwitting subjects. The extensive archive of materials Brennan had compiled during his residence at the property provided unique data for understanding obsessive documentation behavior and its relationship to paranoid ideation. The broader implications of the case extended beyond its immediate circumstances to raise questions about the adequacy of tracking systems for individuals released from institutional care during the 1950s and 1960s. The case highlighted gaps in communication between institutions and law enforcement agencies that may have contributed to similar situations going undetected. Modern researchers studying the case have noted that advances in surveillance technology and communication systems would likely prevent a similar situation from occurring undetected for such an extended period in the contemporary era. However, the basic psychological and environmental factors that enabled Brennan's success remain relevant to understanding current cases involving unauthorized occupation and surveillance. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Brennan to manipulate his environment and maintain control over the property's occupants remain relevant to understanding how individuals can exploit human psychological vulnerabilities for survival and concealment purposes. These insights have contributed to training programs for law enforcement officers and security professionals. The wooded area surrounding the former Aldrich house property has been developed into a nature preserve managed by the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. Park rangers report that the area receives regular use by hikers and nature photographers, though no unusual incidents have been reported since the preserve's establishment. Local historical societies maintain documentation of the case as part of their records of unusual events in Rhode Island history, though the story is rarely discussed in tourism materials or local promotional literature. The case remains a subject of occasional local interest, particularly among residents with memories of the investigation and media coverage from the 1970s. The case continues to be studied by forensic psychologists and criminal justice researchers as an example of long-term criminal concealment and environmental manipulation. Academic interest in the case has remained consistent over the decades since its resolution, with new research papers appearing periodically in specialized journals. The psychological profile of Thomas Brennan, developed by Dr. Vance and subsequent researchers, has been used in training programs for law enforcement officers and mental health professionals to improve recognition of individuals who might pose similar risks to public safety. The documentation maintained by various agencies involved in the case has provided valuable insights into the investigative techniques and communication protocols of the 1970s era, contributing to improvements in how missing persons cases and unusual residential disturbances are handled by contemporary law enforcement. Despite the passage of nearly 5 decades since the events at the Aldrich house, the case remains notable for its demonstration of how environmental factors, psychological manipulation, and social isolation can combine to create circumstances that challenge conventional understanding of criminal behavior and survival adaptation. The question of Thomas Brennan's ultimate fate remains unresolved. Whether he continued his pattern of clandestine survival in other locations, succumbed to the physical demands of his unconventional lifestyle, or found some form of social reintegration, is unknown to authorities. What is certain is that for nearly 18 years, a human being successfully maintained an existence completely hidden from society while living within feet of numerous families and individuals who remained unaware of his presence. The implications of this reality continue to resonate with researchers studying the boundaries between sanity and survival, between social integration and complete withdrawal from human community. The Aldrich House case stands as a reminder that even in an era of increasing surveillance and documentation, it remains possible for individuals to disappear completely from official awareness while continuing to exist in the shadows of ordinary human habitation. The case demonstrates how technical expertise, psychological dysfunction, and environmental opportunity can combine to create circumstances that challenge fundamental assumptions about human behavior and social organization. The legacy of the case extends beyond its immediate circumstances to influence contemporary understanding of missing persons investigations, institutional treatment protocols, and residential security measures. The documentation and analysis produced by Drs. Vance and subsequent researchers continue to inform training programs and investigative procedures used by law enforcement and mental health professionals throughout the United States.